Hi everyone, welcome back to the garden. It's one of the last days of October here, and I'd love to say it's a beautiful autumnal day, the low golden sunlight streaming through the garden, the tropical style plants looking majestic in the final few weeks outside. But the reality is we've had mist today, we've had rain, and it's now a very grey, gloomy end to the day. But all around me, I can hear the autumn leaves falling, there's geese flying overhead, there really is a beautiful autumnal chill in the air. I do actually really enjoy this time of year. And today, I've got an hour free while Harriet has a nap, so I thought I'd come outside and film a quick overwintering video, because that's the kind of guy that I am. But I know I have already got a video on my channel talking about the theory of when I overwinter different exotic plants in my garden. But today I want to talk about what I'm doing specifically this year and my 5-step method of how I look after my plants in winter. I've tried to simplify it, break down how I actually do things here, and hopefully it helps you guys out too. First things first, let's get the technicalities out of the way. I'm sure you'll know this by now. Everywhere in the UK is different, and your location has a huge impact on the plants that you can grow successfully in your garden, the plants you can keep outside in winter, and when you need to start protecting things. Someone on the south coast can have a dramatically longer season to someone in the north of the country, and someone living centrally can potentially get significantly colder spells than someone living in a more sheltered, mild coastal location. So that is definitely a factor. And the best thing I'd say is to actually check your local weather forecast, or maybe join some Facebook groups like Tropical Jungle Style Garden in UK to see what other people are doing with their garden and their plants this year and at what time they're doing it. That's really important. The next thing to say is every single year is different. So as much as I can talk about the technicalities, what you should do and how you should do it, you really need to gauge that forecast and see what's going to happen this year. So last year, 2022, for example, we had that record-breaking scorching summer. Everything was really dry and stressed. And then we had a mild, wet autumn. Everything started growing, and then suddenly we had a really cold spell that hit the garden hard. Everything was racing up and then got cut right back. But one silver lining, it did actually make overwintering, preparing the garden for winter quite easy, because it was literally a case of just before that cold spell, spending a weekend, bringing the tender plants inside, moving others into the polytunnel, wrapping some others up and chopping the ones remaining down so they can be covered up and mulched for winter. So in that sense, it was definitely more efficient than other winters where we tend to see the first frost a little bit earlier. This year, we've actually had a frost already here in the garden, a very light frost. So because of that, I've already begun phase 1 of my plan, which is to bring in the tender houseplants. Here, I grow a lot of elephant seers, alocasia, colocasia, other tropical style plants that come from genuinely tropical environments. And these plants, simply put, bit of a simplification here, they don't enjoy cold weather. And those plants have to be grown on as houseplants through winter as a generalisation. So I bring them in before the real chance of a frost comes. I saw 2 or 3 degrees forecast, and for me, that was enough to bring those plants inside. If you haven't done that already and you live somewhere milder, don't worry about it. Alternatively, if you've already brought everything inside, wrapped everything up, again, that won't be a problem at all. We're now heading into November, so it's about the right time of year. Although in theory, I do try to get as much as I can out of the garden, keep the plants out as long as I possibly can. I do appreciate that you have to do what works for you as well as the garden, and leaving everything till last minute, it's not ideal, is it? Even though I know I'm guaranteed to do it every single year. So step 1, just to summarise, is bring in the house plants. Plants you have to grow on inside, plants that keep their foliage over winter, the plants that really don't like cold weather. And if we had 10 degrees for weeks or months on end, they would just slowly disappear into the ground. So I'm thinking begonia luxurians, the alocasias, anything that's a little bit softer that you really need to keep growing inside. Because with those plants, it'd be a shame if the frost nipped them, because you'd be relying on those leaves to get them through winter and to look good when they go outside late next spring. And when do I bring those plants in? I simply look out for 2 or 3 degrees forecast, which means a good chance of frost. Or if we're pushing into November, when the daytime temperatures start to get close to 10 degrees and the nighttime ones drop below 5, at that point then, they're not really going to be growing much. They're going to be fading, yellowing. So that's the time to bring them inside. They'll be far happier inside than left outside to slowly break down in the cold autumnal weather. The next plants I bring in then, or phase 2 of my arbitrary 2023 overwintering plan, are the Ensete ventricosum Maurelii, the red bananas. and hopefully you can hear me over the robin that's chattering away above me. These plants come in ideally around mid-November. Now, I've already had, like I said, around 2 or 3 degrees for a couple of nights, potentially a light frost. But with these, as the leaves actually get chopped off over winter, I'm not particularly worried about a bit of minor leaf damage. Had those temperatures been less than 2 degrees, freezing maybe 1 degree, I would have decided to bring them in. But the crucial thing with Ensete is when they get to this size, they either have to be dry stored over winter or essentially kept dormant if possible in a very small pot. Pretty much dry storing them, that's how I grow them here. I've done a video all about it that I'll link to in the description below. But basically, you want to minimize the amount of time they spend inside, because while they're inside, they're getting drier, they're getting smaller, they're potentially rotting, and while they're outside, although it doesn't look especially happy, getting rocked about by storms, soaked by the deluges we've had, it's definitely happier outside than inside, because while it's outside, it is still growing, no matter how slowly, and it's less likely to rot. But as we head into November, the chance of it actually beginning to rot increase a little bit. As the daytime temperatures get close to 10 degrees, as the nighttime temperatures get much under 5 degrees consistently, or there is a real chance for hard frost, just before that is the point where I bring them in. So I'm hoping this year it's going to be mid-November. With this Atlantic weather bringing storms, rain and wind, the upside of that is that the frost is generally kept at bay. So hopefully with these, I'll be keeping them outside for a few weeks yet. If you've already brought yours in, don't worry, that's completely fine. I think any time from October through to late November, it's pretty much fair game for most of the UK. But if you haven't brought them in yet, just keep an eye out. And if the forecast temperature is much less than 2 degrees at night, or the daytime temperatures start dropping below 10 degrees, to me that's a signal that you need to bring these plants in at the most convenient day just before then. Quick recap time then, because it's hard to remember facts when you're having this much fun watching a video. The first plants to come in here in my North Lincolnshire garden are the truly tropical houseplants. Those are plants that, simply put, don't like cold, so they come in before the first chance for frost. Then we've got the Ensete ventricosum Maurelii. They come in before the first real hard frost is forecast. That way they can be overwintered inside, safe from the frost and cold, before being brought back out again next spring. Then we've got the biggest group of plants, most of the plants in the garden. Before the weather gets truly frosty, before the first hard frost, freeze of the year, that's when I actually protect the plants which basically stay in the garden, or plants that move into the polytunnel. These are all plants that can take a frost but require some kind of wrapping, moving or protection to really protect them from the deeper winter freezes. And again, I try to do this around mid-November. So in terms of my garden here, we've got the Gunnera manicata behind me. A very, very tough, very hardy plant, but that crown in the middle of it needs protecting from hard winter freezes. So essentially you chop all the leaves down and you use them to create a teepee over the crown itself. And I try to do that before the first real freeze of the year. The Musa basjoo, if you're choosing to wrap yours, whichever way you stand on the subject, if you're going to wrap it, you might as well wrap it before the first real freeze of the year. And then when it comes to the cannas, the gingers, the half-hardy plants that grow in pots, it's time to bring them into the polytunnel. Because although these technically can be hardy plants, I find personally that here in my garden, a lot of the big leafy plants really appreciate a head start in spring. And whenever you're growing a plant in a pot, it's never quite as tough and hardy as one in the ground, because that root system is restricted, it's more likely to freeze through during a prolonged freeze, and it's well worth giving a bit of extra protection. So essentially phase 3 is the most important one for me. It's when I get every plant in the garden that needs a bit of TLC ready for winter. So here in my garden, I get the polytunnel built up around early November. I move the potted cannas and gingers into there, as well as any small exotics, any young exotics in pots. So Scheffler, Techpanax, plants that need a bit of protection from the real freezes, and move them into the polytunnel. And essentially it's about getting the big leaves ready for winter. So I chop the Gunnera down. If I am going to wrap up the Musa basjoo or Musa Tibet, that's the point that I do it. The cannas, I generally chop them down and get them mulched ready. Because although the foliage can take a frost, at that point in mid to late November, you're not going to get much growth out of them anyway. You might as well get them mulched to know that it's a job done and you're ready for winter. So essentially phase 3 is look around your garden. You've already brought the tender plants in. What is there that you need to do something to get ready for winter? If it's a pot, Does it need to be put into a polytunnel greenhouse? Does it need to be brought closer to your house for a bit of protection from the real hard freezes? And if you've got any big leaves in your garden, yes, they can take a frost, but if they need wrapping up before winter, I think mid to late November is the time to do it. It's also a good time to pack some leaves, straw or fleece into the crown of your tree ferns before the first proper hard frosts, because those new croziers, next year's growth, are deep down inside that crown. They can take a light frost just fine deep down in there, but it's worth protecting them before the first hard frost. It's something that once it's done, it's done. You definitely don't need to worry about wrapping them just yet. One point I will add, if you've got any plants in your garden you're going to build overhead covers for, like agaves, any plants like half-hardy palms such as my Butiagris that you say you're going to build some temporary protection for over winter, now is the time to do it. Any point from late October through to late November is a great time to get protecting them, so it's done, you don't have to worry about it, and it also keeps the water out of the crowns. So essentially by this point, everything you can preemptively do in your garden is basically done. The tender plants come inside before the first proper cold, the Ensete come in before the first proper frost, and then everything else gets cut down, wrapped, mulched, brought into polytunnel before the first real hard frost or freezes on the horizon. And then it's really just a case of waiting and seeing what winter does. As long as you follow steps 1 to 3, then in a mild winter, or if you live in a sheltered location, most years everything should be absolutely fine. The plants that die down to the ground should come up again in spring, and you shouldn't need to wrap any of the other plants outside. But in a colder winter or in a particularly sharp frost, you might need to wrap certain plants and protect them a little bit more, and that's stage 4. Here in North Lincolnshire, I would say a mild winter is around -3 degrees centigrade, which doesn't happen that often. We usually get a little bit colder than that. But if things do drop below then, if you see in the forecast -4, -5, it's well worth taking things to that next level. Stage 4 for me is the reactive preparation. You've seen that cold forecast. Which plants in your garden need a bit of extra temporary protection to get them through that cold spell without any kind of winter damage? So to give you an example, the tree ferns. If I see less than -3 forecast, the plants themselves should be fine. They should come back next year, but I tend to wrap up the top foot of trunk. I just get a length of horticultural fleece, wrap it round it, tie it on with some string. You can make it look pretty with coffee bags if you want, but that's essentially what I do. And that just keeps the cold away from the main growing point of the plant. And it's also reassuring to know that if the temperatures forecast do actually end up significantly lower, which can happen, that the plant should be absolutely fine. You've done everything you can and it will be okay for the duration of that spell. At this point, I don't start fleecing any palms as such, anything like that. A -4, -5 shouldn't be a problem for them, assuming that it's not a long duration of cold. But it's a case really of just going out in your garden, making sure that anything like a tree fern has got the leaves in the crown, that you have wrapped the top foot of trunk. Is there anything that's not completely bulletproof hardy in a pot? Outside in a cold part of your garden, bring it in closer to the house. If you grow any slightly less than completely hardy palms, such as Phoenix canariensis, then it's well worth protecting them if they're young for these cold spells with some fleece. Give them a proper wrapping, but make sure as temperatures get milder again that you take it off. I think at this point really -4, -5, for most plants in my garden here, it's absolutely no reason to panic at all, but it's worth just looking after those precious ones like the tree ferns, just going that extra mile to keep them protected while the cold spell's here. Now you lucky people, it's time for stage 5, the one I'm sure you've all been waiting for. This is what I do when I see a temperature forecast that's less than -5 degrees. For me, that really is the point where it starts to become worth wrapping other plants in the garden and protecting them. Obviously, it depends on the exact temperature forecast. -10 is very different to -6, and the duration of the cold. A long freeze at -5 or -6 can potentially do a lot more damage than a brief dip to -9, so that's important to keep in mind. But to me, whenever I see what class is severe cold forecast, at that point then, I actually make the decision to go out and wrap more of the tree ferns. At this point, you want to make sure that the tree ferns are properly wrapped, not just the top foot there, particularly if the temperatures are heading closer to that -10 area. At this point, when you see temperatures less than -5 forecast, I always think it's well worth going out into your garden with a head torch if you have to, and just seeing what's still out there and what might need a bit of extra care. It's not just the tree ferns. If you grow palms, feather palms especially, like Butea and Jubea, if they're younger plants, it's well worth fleecing them for the duration of this cold spell. Because although they're technically very hardy, can take -10, -12, that's in mature sizes, often in hotter climates. So if they're still a young plant, less than a metre tall, it's well worth wrapping them, but again, only for the duration of the cold spell. When it comes to softer ground ferns like Pteris umbrosa, whenever I see these temperatures forecast, I put a fleece right over the top of it. And it's probably not a bad idea to have some fleece stocked up now. In case you see these temperatures, you grow a lot of young exotic plants, you can then cover them for the cold spell. Now, most of the really hardy plants like Trachycarpus, they should be completely fine these temperatures, even in smaller sizes. But if you've got them potted, you assume they'd be okay. I potentially would bring them closer to the house if there's a real prolonged freeze forecast, just to keep them safe. So to me, stage 5 is very much a reactive stage in the garden. You don't need to do this every winter, but if you do see temperatures much less than -5 forecast, it's well worth, and I really would recommend, go out into your garden, just check what's out there, because it's really easy to forget about a certain young plant you maybe bought later in the summer, you've planted it out and you've completely forgotten about it. It's well worth just looking at the palms you've got in your garden, and although they might be sold as hardy palms, are they actually hardy to those temperatures? Just have a quick look. And if those palms are only hardy to -10 in larger sizes, it might be worth putting a couple layers of fleece over them just for the real coldest spell. Obviously, it's no guarantee that nothing will take damage, but it's well worth giving the plants a little bit of extra care for these real cold events when they hit, because that's often the difference between them actually looking great, green, fresh and full of life for next year versus struggling with browning leaves or fronds and really taking a while to bounce back. It's well worth putting the effort in. But as always, I really would recommend, when it comes to applying fleece or any kind of protection wrapping for these cold spells, don't use plastic, don't use anything that traps the moisture in, and only use it for the duration of the cold spell. As soon as temperatures get above freezing, take the fleece off, let the plant breathe, and that way you're less likely to induce rot and have more problems affecting the plant later in spring. I really do think it's helpful then, rather than seeing the plants in your garden as tropical style plants and hardy exotics, there's obviously quite a big grey area in the middle. And for me, when you break them down into categories, it makes overwintering so much easier. And simply put, you've got the real tender houseplants, the plants that don't like the cold. You've got plants like Ensete, which you bring in before the first proper frost. You've then got the plants in your garden, the rest of the bold exotics. These are the ones that need to come in, get wrapped up, get chopped down before winter. And you might as well do that before the first proper hard frost or the first real freeze of winter. These are the plants that need this doing every single winter, regardless of how cold it gets. And once you've done those 3, you're set for most winters. It's really just a case of keep an eye on the weather, or if you're in the Facebook tropical style plant groups, see what other people are doing. And then phase 4, if there is a dip below -3 degrees C, something like that, wrap up the tree ferns and make sure there's nothing else in your garden which does need fleecing. Any plant like a young Phoenix canariensis that's in an exposed location, just bring the pots closer to your house and be aware of what's in your garden. And then stage 5 is when things do get significantly colder, when there's a prolonged freeze like last year forecast, when the temperatures drop below -5, it's worth protecting before that stage, wrapping the plants that might need a bit of extra TLC. But if there's any plants I've not addressed in the video, feel free to leave a comment in the section below and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. I have got a playlist all about overwintering exotic plants, so check some of those out for full detailed plant specific guides. Now there is a stage 6, which I think I'll call the Armageddon phase. This is where, if we're unlucky enough to see a -15 degrees C forecast, something like that, which can be very problematic in the exotic garden. At that point then, I would fully wrap the tree ferns. The Jubea, the Butea, the feather palms, they will get completely covered over as well. And at that point then, it really is about survival. But I won't mention that because I'd like to think that really is an extreme scenario. So I hope for most normal winters, including this very one, this video's helped you out. But as always, leave a comment below and I will get back to you. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you in the next video.